All right, welcome to the Express Technical Committee meeting for April 1st, 2020. We have a few topics on our agenda, and we'll see how far we can get through them with our 1 hour of time. First thing, which is usually always goes to the top, is just wanted to mention we have a couple active security issues going on. So we'll go over some of that here. We need to also, I was pinged on it this past weekend from the OpenJS Foundation that we need to get our code of conduct all set up. So we'll go over a couple things there. From the last meeting, I know there was especially questions about like what things like need to be done in parallel, like that, if you're looking for something to do in parallel and stuff like that with Express 5. I mentioned there's, a bunch of like work that needs to be done, at least even just on our Express website. And that's usually pretty low hanging stuff. So those are always good places to get started. Doesn't mean like anybody has to necessarily do that because it is docs. Not everybody likes docs, but I at least went through there and I got like at least a little bit of a list together, some stuff I saw from just looking around. So that way we'll go over what those are. And then, we also have some general Express 5 progress updates that will go on after that. And then there's an additional proposed item for some feedback stuff from one of the pull requests that we'll see if we get to. So yeah, I'll take it off real quick with some security things. So there's two active ones right now. So we have one where one of the modules has a dependency that has a sub-dependency that has been flagged, on those audit systems like NPM audit and Snike and all those things. It was kind of waiting for the sub-dependency to update. That finally did happen today. Interestingly enough, it seemed like it completely changed the supported versions of Node.js, which kind of made it a little bit of a hiccup for us to update. Thankfully, I did. Well, as soon as I saw it, like a few hours after they published it, I opened up an issue with them. And it seems like, and for discussion, just because it doesn't seem clear about what versions they're even going to support. So even if we need to make a new major version bump for that module to update the dependency, it's very unclear, just like what to even set our minimum version to. So we'll see what they say from that. So it's kind of like pending on what their plan is on that front. The second one was a report through our security system. I put it in our security section. I don't know if triagers can actually see that area. I know obviously the TC members can. It still is in the early stages, so not really going to mention any specifics here. I just wanted to just call it out. That's also has to do generically with one of our middlewares, though it seems a very low severity thing. Obviously, we'll have to discuss that to see what we think of it in a general sense and get some kind of like fix out. So I just wanted to go over that real quick, and especially to call attention to the TC members to go any thoughts they have on that report there. So yeah, the next thing I wanted to just knock out real quick is the code of conduct. I know that we have as the triagers was to, I think one of the bullet points in like the initial PR template was to accept the code of conduct, even though we didn't really like technically have one. So we had a PR that was opened up back as part of a task that the OpenJS gave us, and Wes was heading that up. So he opened up PR with one of them was a code of conduct. It had kind of fallen off because their code of conduct requires a email address to report to. And so I pinged OpenJS guys again, and they actually got that all set up for us. So we got that. I updated all that PR to get the email address there, the suggested changes from it. And so as far as I can tell, it's basically ready. And I just wanted to call that attention out before I merged it, just so especially any of the TC members can like make sure that there isn't anything that they would object to. And I'm not talking about like typos and stuff that can always be fixed, but I mean like just of its essence, just as a last call before it actually gets merged in there. It's a standard code of conduct that OpenJS Foundation uses in general, so it's not really too crazy. So, also all the TC members would have gotten an email from getting joined to those OpenJS lists as well. Yesterday or the day before. So John linked to the code of conduct pull request. That's in the Express repo number 4143. So yeah, those are just a couple like kind of announcement-ish items. All right, so the next thing I just wanted to head into real quick, it was I think kind of popular from the previous thing about what can, especially people like looking for, especially like starting off helping with, especially specifically about the Express 5 effort versus like the general triaging of general issues. One of the points that I knew like we had a lot of like missing pieces because we never really got to, and even the current Express 5 docs was contributed someone who actually did a pretty good job trying to remove all the deprecated stuff from there. But that was pretty much it. So there's an issue I ended up opening with my notes in the Express.js.com repository. Its number is 1126. And it just has a kind of the general list of a few of the different ones that I saw while going through there. So I'm not going to specifically go over all of them here, but just to call that out for anyone who wants to help along in that. They're all, like I said, they're docs, so they're pretty straightforward things. And I mean that obviously in the general sense, right? Like obviously doesn't mean like, when it says like, an example is that missing docs around next router, right? So like, obviously if you have no clue what that even is, it's less straightforward to you, but the general sense of getting something documented is pretty straightforward. And if anybody doesn't, someone wants to do it and doesn't know what to do, like they're welcome to do that. Just open up another issue, split out or something like that.
So the key question I have is how critical these are for Express 5. Probably these things did not come up in the past when we actually discussed and went through the list of critical items. Is this kind of late revelations or some missing pieces when you went through the doc, which you think is good to have as opposed to a blocker set of list?
Yeah, so these are from the request from last thing of what to do in parallel, right? Like, obviously some of them can be some of them, like the importance of them obviously vary, right? At that, like we can release stuff that's completely undocumented and that doesn't mean, and it's not released. Of course, do people know how to use that? Probably not really if you don't even describe it. So it really depends on how important you think docs are on being able to use it.
So you mean to say missing these docs would really mean that we are not truly representing the current state of the APIs?
Yeah, like for example, I know we made a big deal about Express 5 is how it supports promises, but of course we have zero documentation anywhere around how to do that. So it kind of like takes, if we want to like actually release it and put like a big announcements out about how, it has this promise support, but have zero description anywhere that we can even point users to what that means, seems like a miss. Now, it doesn't mean we can't release it on the technical level. So I just want to make that clear, is that it doesn't prevent it from being released, but it certainly would hinder any kind of like, the effectiveness of an announcement of new features that we don't describe or document anywhere.
Yeah, I think this is me. I mean, I think the docs are critical personally, as someone who's used Express for a while. If we're making a big announcement for Express 5, I know a lot of people have been waiting for this and are excited specifically about the promise support. it would be, I feel like we'd be kind of shooting ourselves in the foot to do a big announcement and finally get it out there and not have at least baseline docs. Of course, we can always build upon those, but
Right.
and I'm definitely am excited, happy to support, try to put some docs together. I think this list is super helpful.
Yep. And the important thing to note is that they're not even, the list doesn't even, I just went through and I didn't like the stuff that was documented. I didn't really like go in to say how high of a quality is it per se, right? I was just mainly just looking for the obvious gaps, if that makes sense. And so, some of them, one of them I saw, I think like the second one is not really, is kind of minor, but yeah, the biggest one I think is really the promises one. I had opened up a separate issue about that, I don't know, a while back, February, as part of trying to get it documented of like, especially what like the big missing piece was. And so I just linked that in there. I didn't make issues for each one of these because some of them are pretty easy. But yeah, and so that's just something, so like I said, to work in parallel. It's, we obviously still have, like, I just, like the beta, or no, sorry, alpha 8 was just published, like less than a week ago. So it's certainly out there and usable. Ideally, like if at all possible, we get people like playing around with it. I tried to get like a couple coworkers who maintain like a few different things to kind of play with it at the end of last week. And so I haven't really followed up with them yet, but so just to see like what their experience is, at least upgrading to current. I told them it probably wouldn't be as bad as it will be since it doesn't have the route changes in there yet, which is another thing that has to be documented. I only put on this list what's published. I actually should probably put another list of like what is definitely coming, but we don't have documented. Now, one of those is a pull request. That's the path the regex change that was put together in the migration guide. But it still, of course, is in the migration guide and not really in the actual docs itself. But yeah, so there's just kind of like a couple things there. That was all I'm trying to think. I think that was all off the top of my head about that I had for the Express.js stuff.
On the router, that's router 2.0, which is being released on the router repo. And I think I don't have it in front of me, but I think that I know that we have change logs for that. Yeah. I forget who it was, but I think somebody in this meeting was making those change logs, et cetera, on 2.0. So I'm not sure that all of the changes are there, but they should be. But so if anybody did want to get a jump start on writing the docs for that stuff, you should be able to find the major changes and some examples in the changelog on router 2.0, which is still a pull request, I'm pretty sure, like Doug was saying. So
yeah, I can attempt some of these today. I just came to know this issue. Okay, this is open just 1 hour ago. Yeah, I'll go through this and see how many of these things I can pick it up. Not necessarily all of them, but I will update the issue tracker with which are the items which I can pick up.
And in terms of blocking, I agree with Ryan that I think that having the docs at the very least, even if they're not in their perfect form, having docs for everything that's changed I would suggest that would be a blocker for mainline release, like to NPM.
Yeah, like effectively, you're talking about like just at least a blocker to publishing the actual 5.0.0 without any like preview pieces on it, I would assume.
I'm okay, because I assume we're going to do like a release candidate before it actually gets cut. I'm okay. I don't like the idea, but I'm okay with that release candidate coming out before we have the docs. But at the very least, obviously we can, that is definitely, in my opinion, blocking before we give it to actual people. So, which I mean, I'm happy to say it's blocking, because then like anyone else that wants to contribute to it, I'm more than happy to do that stuff too. So.
I mean, from my perspective, docs are really important because that is an entry point for the users to understand the new APIs or the API changes and things like that. But thinking practically, I mean, looking at 5 or 6 items we have in the plate for the Express 5, and it would actually mean that we are bringing 5 or 6 new items into the plate as well. So it's going to add up to the overall effort. And looking from the past, the key question is how long it's going to take further to get it out. So probably with this much item coming newly, something worthwhile to discuss is, what is the timeline we are looking at? What is the commitment each one of us is going to take up to make sure that this is, as a team, we are able to get it out, in a timely fashion. So I'm committed. I can take it up. I need to really figure out. I don't have, beforehand understanding about most of this. Need to dig through the doc and the code to figure out what these things and etc. But yeah, just
So
putting
that,
it.
yeah, myself included, I'm looking through this list. They're familiar, but I don't have
Right.
right now the intimate knowledge I'd need. But I think perhaps that's something we could, for everyone, myself included, who is interested in contributing to the docs to help get that over the line, maybe we could do some type of separate call as a group. So we kind of like kill all that at once, and everyone kind of can go through these and look at PRs and code and help understand what generally these things are, so we can all contribute to the docs.
Yeah.
That's why I bring up the point of the release candidate, because I'm assuming there's going to be like some window, maybe a week or 2 weeks, or I'm not sure. We've mentioned it before, but I'm not sure what that period is. But at the because then we could then focus everybody on the docs. I mean, I would love to get them done today or tomorrow, et cetera. But at the very least, once we have a release candidate, we know what is going to change, and then we have a diff too, so it'll be a little bit easier to discover. At least that's my thinking. I have no idea. Yeah, I'm super happy. I'm super happy to switch gears to docs, but it's right as it is right now. I also don't have the visibility into everything that's changed. So
right, and in fact, I actually got this list basically just reviewing the actual like tiers change log from Express, like 5 branch, and then comparing it, searching for each one of the changes on the site. So just to be clear about how I found them and why it's also a rough list, because I didn't really like dig deep in anything. But yeah, there definitely will be, because we still have to do like at least like the one more release that has the path to regex like upgrade changes from the router. In that. So, I mean, we still have some time. And like you said, I think there's a couple things there that I think are perfectly valid to do. Like, we don't have to do all the docs, like literally right now. Whatever we can do is always fine. We can always say, hey, once that's released, then we start hard going on the docs. I'd like the idea, too, of like, potentially even like having like a working session that's, separate from obviously like the actual technical committee meeting. If we want to like get together, just kind of like talk about it, like live question and answering session, kind of like, as they say, like high bandwidth, right? Communication versus like, over the, back and forth over the actual GitHub, to kind of like go over some of those things, because a lot of those things, it's kind of like once you know where to look or where to go, it starts to become clearer. But like at first, it's always just like, well, what is this thing really?
I just realized, correct me if I'm wrong, I just realized, like I said, correct me if I'm wrong. Do we have a tracking issue for examples? I just looked at the example repo and there's a lot of examples. So that's potentially something that we'll have to update the examples too. Or at least, we could potentially not port them over or whatever, but I just realized that we should at least go through those to make sure that they're not out of date with V5. So
yeah, so there's a good point. There's no tracking issue. Because they're part of it, I don't think all of them, most of them, the examples are part of the actual test Express suite itself. So at least all the ones that are definitely work with 5. But that doesn't even necessarily mean it's taking advantage of any new Express 5 APIs. So, what I mean by that is like, it supports, promises in the router now. So like, in theory, like there's like, it makes sense to update the examples to use that kind of stuff. We never really did that through when we went from 3 to 4, which you can probably tell in some of those things too. And even the examples are ideally supposed to demonstrate the best, good ways to use, the Express APIs for some specific scenario. And that's kind of like the idea of the examples. So I think we can certainly do whatever we want to do in that regard as well. So there's just some context, like, yes. And I have not really paid too much attention to them besides just that they function, at least the ones in their tests. But otherwise they just kind of been like left there. And that's just to say like what the state they are in, right? So we don't have like an examples champion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd be okay with, I'd be okay with punting on, rather docs priority, examples we can fix after the release comes out or ask the community to help out with, et cetera, or even potential. That sounds like a conversation for another time, but I'm glad that I thought about that. So.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely say they're not super critical, especially compared to just like the generic docs for having, some of the information out there. In fact, really, if you think about, if I were to say like the most critical doc to have, of course, is the migration guide, which we do have a pretty good start on that. Some, people were like walking through that because that will be, you really have two sets of users coming to Express 5, right? People who have been using Express, have Express existing apps, usually, 4 is really all we particularly care about to make the guide for, since they can technically walk through 3 to 4 and then 4 to 5 if they really are that far behind. And then, you have the new users as well. And so those users and existing users would both be interested, at least, especially in some of the newer features that has made Express 5 be breaking in the first place. And I know, like I said, people have been all over the place. I think, John, you're the one I was actually looking, because you linked an issue to another repo that talking about like some module, I think it was, that added promise support.
Express async errors, which I've used a lot. They're going to break in V5, so I gave them a heads up.
Yep. And I noticed that they actually pointed out a gap in there in your thing. The fact that the PARM does not support promises the same way. So I don't know if we want to do anything about that or not, but I did notice that, and I didn't look too hard into it besides saying, oh yeah, we didn't do anything around promises in there, but it is what it is right now. But there's still opportunity there if we really think that that is critical or not. But I just saw that, so I thought that was amusing. But yes, my point of mentioning that was, as I saw you do that, and I know a lot of people have been using third-party modules to do like async functions and stuff, because I think a lot of people do want to do like, have a middleware that's like an async function, so they can just blah 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 await something, blah 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 await something, and then do whatever next, because that way you got the nice linear path there versus a bunch of callbacks. So that's definitely, I think, the biggest feature benefit that we're adding here. Let's see. So I think that pretty much is all for the Express 5 docs. Oh yeah, that was the only one thing to add. I did go through while I was looking through the site, and I tried to get pretty much as possible closed or merged from the pull request section. And so we went from like, I don't know, 2 pages of pull requests to now 4 outstanding. So that is significantly better than where we just were. Rand has mostly been like the person who does the Express site, but I know that he has been only comes around in sporadic little splurts, and that's it. So that's another reason why a lot of it got backed up. And so I figured, especially if we're gonna like have a bunch of people looking at the docs, probably to not have any like, the less conflicts like in merging that it can make, the better. So that's why I kind of like just went through and just combed through all those PRs. They were mostly all just pretty low hanging fruit and get them all merged. So that was pretty nice. There. So yeah, anything else that any other thoughts that people have about the site/docs at all before we move on to the next topic?
I guess for me, I'd like to add that I use the Express migration docs to to move our current existing application from 4 to Alpha 7. And the experience was quite smooth for me. The minimum documentation that was there kind of helped me to double check what might be breaking. So I was quite pleasantly happy with the experience. I was wondering what extra more would we be looking for when we sort of port these applications that would be helpful to the team to know or to debug, or would we want to track this in an issue? How many successful applications we might have ported in the real world?
Yeah, I think we can track that. Let's make a tracking issue for that too, because like I said, I've messed with a couple on that on my own, and I've asked a couple people around. I think like we'll probably want to put like which one that we upgraded to, because I think like the next one that we're going to release here soon, which would be either like beta 1 or RC1, whichever one that would be, the one that's going to be after Alpha 8, because it will include the new router changes. That will be definitely the one where user experience will really help probably like fine tune that migration guide. It's not obviously a requirement to fine tune the migration guide, but of course, all the better people's experience, because that's where it definitely changes a lot of those little route pathing stuff. And I think that that has the most potential to be kind of like confusing / potentially time consuming. Because some of those will probably, your app will still start, but then some of the routes might not work right, or you might get weird regex errors thrown when you try to start your app. That's a couple things I saw when I was trying to like mess around with it just a little bit the other day. So yeah, I think that would be a good one. You can certainly, I don't even know where to track that issue at. Express repo, discussion repo, express.js.com. I really have no clue. So if someone wants to open one, the first place it gets open, that's where it's going to be. We can of course always move it if we feel like it should be somewhere else, but I kind of like think that the main Express repo probably makes the most sense. The secondary would be like the website, if like the idea is to improve the website documentation through that. But certainly being on the Express repo would probably have the most visibility, and maybe other people would just suddenly randomly try to do it, which would be awesome.
The issue you want to track specifically is people's experiences migrating, etc.
Yeah. So like say like, hey, I have some kind of, 1500 Slack app, and I was on, I went from Express 4.17 to 5, Alpha 7 or Alpha 8 or whatever, and everything just, I didn't have any problems at all, and like, or I encountered some stuff, but the migration docs answered my questions, so that was sweet. Or like, here's something that I encountered that it didn't seem straightforward, or like maybe my whole workflow is broken now and this sucks. I don't know. Like I said, most of the things are pretty straightforward. A lot of the stuff that we had put to 5 as breaking were sometimes out of abundance of caution. As an example, the promises is a good example of that, because there were people effectively accidentally returning promises from all their handlers. And so like errors were just being swallowed into the ether before, and trying to add it suddenly made them pop up in routes 500ing that actually worked technically fine. They just didn't bother to clean up their error, their rejection of their promises. So that's kind of like an example of where, even like one we were just talking about with the whole change of like using like res.status to do it instead of like just directly setting a status code. Like that one, I doubt that the people who have problems with that are just the really weird edge cases stuff, but still, like, that's the stuff we can throw in there into the next major as abundance of caution. Now I'm just saying that as a general sense. I don't want to keep saying throw stuff into 5, because I don't mean that either. Just that we'd put into whatever the next major is when that issue comes up or whatever. So, especially when we talk about, because I want to keep reiterating that we had a discussion before of cadence, and that right now it seems like the general consensus is that we would ideally try to shoot for, after this potentially like, having a major like approximately once a year, obviously depend on if there's anything to even release on it. But that way we actually have a cadence window And that would be a discussion as soon as after Express 5 releases and what's our future plans for that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So, I mean, I guess that kind of like goes a little bit into some of the Express 5 progress updates itself. Couple things that I just wanted to go over a little bit was that the router module did get a new release, beta 1, that includes pretty much the last real changes that would be in it, which is basically getting out the all the changes to the route stuff. So that's the whole path to regex update. It went from ancient version, which is like, I don't know, 0.1.x or something, to not even the latest version. I don't know what, I don't know exactly why we didn't go to the latest, but I mean, I'm not going to like try to push that at this point. We're certainly much closer to the latest now. I think it's like, what, 4 or whatever, 6, something like that. Regex, path to regex, like 4 or 6. It's like 2 major versions behind the current, but that's only because the one major version was like thrown out the window. And so so we're really only 1 major version behind the most recent on that guy, which is fine. Yeah, that one I found a whole bunch of like weird edge cases and stuff while doing that, and got all those kind of fixed up as it was getting merged in. So pretty confident that we don't have any accidental breakage. That doesn't mean obviously purposeful breakage, but that's obviously to be seen once we start trying to put weird stuff on it. Obviously we got that Express 5 Alpha 8 out, so that doesn't have any actual changes. That was supposed to have gone out a long time ago, but just kind of like got forgotten. So that basically just brings up the Express 5 line up into the same with all the changes that were in the latest 4 line, which especially has important things like the whole same site cookie stuff, which was that whole thing going around. So certainly people trying to migrate without that probably couldn't truly use it and stuff, because of that same site cookie stuff wouldn't have been there. So they actually, at least we do have right now a version that people can use, more successfully. Tons of PRs got merged, kind of like did the same thing that I got done through the Express.js.com repo, going to Express repo. Got a whole bunch of like example changes that were sitting there merged, a bunch of doc changes merged. I don't know, probably like 11 or so PRs. So we got all those kind of like landed out there. Started spinning up the 4.18 branch, but then got like a couple security things thrown at me, so I didn't get that quite finished up there, but do have the branch out there and just have to like smack some stuff on top of that to get the PR open. And that will have those two. That will have basically like, I think there's only like really those 3 things. There's the 2 deprecation pieces. So the query deprecation, which is finished, and then the non-integer status code deprecation, which that PR is also, I believe, finished. That wasn't the one we were just talking on today. No, that's right. At first I thought that's what we were talking on, but it wasn't. So it was the actual 5 one. So, and this one's finished as well. So we'll get those 2 landed on there, and then that router patch for that bug that was reported. We'll go on there, get that PR open.
So just trying to understand about 4.18. Do you get the patches for the 405 PRs, which we are talking about, and then put it in your local stuff and push against the 4.18 branch? Or do you land those PRs first onto the master and then cut it into 4.18? What is the approach which you take?
So I edit. So what I basically do is I go into the PR that's going to land there, and you hit at the top. Not sure if triagers can see that or not, but you basically hit edit at the top where you usually edit the title of the PR. And then it says blah blah wants to merge 2 commits into, and you just change the base to 4.18 and save it, and then you merge it there. So that's kind of like the process.
Okay.
And that way it's mainly that way the pull request just shows what the changes were. The pull request, the pull request itself will show merged before it's on master, because it got merged into basically the 4.18 branch, which then gets merged into master. It's just a fast forward. It's not at that point. So that's kind of like what those release PRs are, if that makes sense. And yeah, so we'll get that done there.
What was the challenger blocker for the deprecation PRs, which you said? I missed that point.
There are none. I said they're already completed.
Okay. So as soon as 4.18 branches out, users will start seeing the deprecation once they use it.
Exactly. Yep. So we publish 4.18, and then the users, when they upgrade it, they'll see the deprecation, which basically gives them the heads up that, they not only is it deprecated, which of course someone will have to go update the Express.js.com website to mark them as deprecated in 4.18 around that time. There's little banners that you put up on the deprecated APIs. It's just like a docs as well that they're deprecated, and that way they can move to a different API that's been in Express 4, which just part of that is meant to ease the transition from 4 to 5, because it's like, if you don't have any deprecations in your 4 code, then you're certainly, that's that much less work you have to do when you go to the next major version. Besides, we're trying to chase people off of some of those. In particular, trying to chase people off of the extended query parser unless they actually need it, because there's contention around that one, especially about whether or not that's really, like, there are not vulnerabilities there. There aren't in a general sense, but people can accidentally code them in. So the idea is, that was the reason why those got deprecated, was the idea is to have people opt in to having extended behavior where it like can parse things into arrays and objects and things. So that way they at least kind of like are opting into the basically more expansive behavior versus getting that by default. And that's just part of like the general community trying to push to more secure by default kind of settings versus, I guess, super featureful by default. So that's where that one comes into play. The statuses is, that one was just because of people, it throws in a weird spot, so it's very hard to debug. And people shouldn't be doing that anyways. So that one is much less nuanced for sure. But yeah, so those are those 2 pull requests. Hopefully that answers your question. Sorry, I kind of ramble on being there. Cool. So yeah, so that's basically the plan there. So, and just to reiterate too, from what was said before, is that basically 4.18, of course, like anything that lands on 4, it's forward merged into the 5.0 branch, which basically lands all that stuff into the 5.0 feature thing. So like the router patch and things like that. Then we'll go ahead and get those rest of the stuff on top of there, including things like I know John was curious about, which is the we'll bump the depth of router from alpha 1, I think it is, or alpha 2, whatever the alpha was, and we'll just change it to beta 1, and that will get in there that way. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of other things we had slated for 5 that I know we knocked off the list. I actually went and I was editing our tracking issue for what's supposed to be in 5, which was in the Express repo. And I started editing it, trying to like trim away all those stuff that we already knocked off from it. I don't think I finished that. I finished removing the rest of the stuff from there that's not part of 5 that we always got in there. So we can get that, so we can make for sure that list is truly an accurate list of what we're putting in here. Like as an example, like there was a request to fix the views to resolve pass async, but we're not putting that in there. We'll have to pass like another one, like 6 or something like that. As just an example, I gotta remove that from the list after this meeting. New path matching syntax, yeah, that's in there. Separate locals and options, yeah, that's not landing because I don't think there's actually an open PR for that at all. It's just an issue. And of course, we already punted on that to get Bob out the door faster. Looks like I have to actually update the description itself to remove stuff about HTTP2 things. In fact, on HTTP2, I think about it, it's kind of Express 5 related, but the SPDY project, which actually provided a HTTP 1 to 2 layer that actually functioned, unlike the core's HTTP2, apparently has been updated and actually works for modern versions of Node. So it's now once again back to being a drop-in HTTP2 enabler on Express, for example. So it's pretty sweet package. So that was actually pretty cool that they're moving on that guy again. Thought that package was basically abandoned at this point, but if not. Any other questions, thoughts, etc. around the Express 5 tasks, updates, what exactly is going to be in there, etc. before we move on? I know we're getting close to the end of the meeting, so the other, actually, that does remind me. So like there was from that discussion that happened a couple weeks ago about the removal of the rec and res prototype. It was a little unclear to me about whether we're going to move forward or not, but these past couple of weeks, there's been 0 activity on it. So I assume that means we're not moving forward with that needing to be in Express 5. That's where I'm just going to like assume by default here, unless I hear otherwise, because it doesn't seem like that repo is, like the repos are there, but they're in that basically the initial state. And then they haven't actually had any activity since. So I didn't know if anybody wanted to like had any thoughts on that guy or not. I saw John.
I'll try to circle up with Wes on it. I had some questions about it. I volunteered to help him, but I haven't made time to do it. So I'll get him on Twitter, see what he thinks.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to make for sure that if he still intends to get it in, we don't miss it, for example. So that's the main reason I just wanted to mention it. Was because I was a little unclear, and then I have been monitoring it, but I haven't had time to myself participate into it. So I just wanted to make for sure it didn't get like lost by accident, for example. I mean, obviously wouldn't be the end of the world. It's like if we miss anything, because we can always put it in the next one, but just wanted to call that one out there specifically because I know we had a large thread on it.
Let me ask you a question about it real quick. So I messed around with it and I learned how to use git filter branch to pull those files out and preserve all of their Git history into a new repository. Would you prefer that, or do you care about keeping that history in the blames?
Yes, good point. I did see that question. I kind of like hoped that maybe Wes would reply to it. So if you want, my own opinion is that you can certainly do that. Whether or not it's really ultimately useful, probably not really. What I mean by that is because it will preserve Git blame. Whether or not that those commits will actually be functional until your effectively real initial commit is probably unlikely. Every time we've split out modules so far in the past, we just basically just copied it at the point in time and just said, and now it exists. And then I think like we made it, the change in the history was like initial import from, Express or something like that. So really, I would say like, I'm fine with it either way. If you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. So my opinion is really like, I don't my opinion is really like, I guess at that point, whatever you want to do, I'm fine with not preserving the history if that's part of the question.
It's time consuming, and so unless it was an emphatic yes, then I'll just drop it. Don't worry about it.
Yep. Because like I said, it is useful to have that history there, and it does suck to lose it, of course, but you know, things, it is what it is, so I guess we'll just live on. Makes me wonder if you can probably like do some weird dark magic in the future, and like, you know, if you've ever seen Git graphs, you could like do a Git graft onto the Express repo for it if you knew which commit it came from. So if you haven't seen that before and you were thinking of Git filter, you could probably, it might be an interesting thing just to Google for your own self. It's pretty crazy. So yeah, cool. So I will, it wasn't, I think it was in the list in the tracking issues. That's why one of the things I mentioned, I won't remove the bullet point of it for now. But depending, if we hear back on some kind of thing, especially if it's a definite like, oh no, just skip it, then I'll definitely just remove that bullet point from the tracking issue of the things that we're going to land in 5. And I think it also has an issue that's part of the milestone. So then I'll remove the milestone from that issue, that tracking issue. Cool, so that will get it there. So if there's nothing else, I guess we'll move on to the last kind of item we have, which was by Suresh. If you want to take it over for your agenda item.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, looking at PR number 3621, the comment raised by the contributor, not necessarily the sole comment triggered me to add this to the agenda, but definitely this one triggered, plus a couple of other observations in the various repository in the organization about the whole PR review process, if I put it that way, if that makes sense. So I guess it's worthwhile for us to have a conversation and reflection around, is there anything that we can do better so that we can improve the overall user satisfaction of the contributors? So in this particular case, I would say it has been 2 years. So there could be various reasons why it got dragged that much. But then at every point in time, what is a forward progress, or what is a promise we are making, or what is the, I would say, roadmap. It doesn't make any sense to say a roadmap for a PR, but when it goes beyond certain time limits, beyond unexpected timelines, it is probably worthwhile to have an expectation on either side about how these things are going. So I have a couple of proposals how the overall experience can be improved. Number one, I see single person review in many of the PRs. Definitely, we've been through that discussion in the past as well, probably to do with lack of active committers in the project. So definitely the improvement that we can have is to have more committers, more people reviewing the PRs. And second one, this is a pattern which I observed across the board, is the red X, that is the objections come pretty fast, whereas it doesn't go away at the same pace. Of course, the objections, the reason for the objections may be still around, is maybe a reason why the red X goes away. But one of the things where we can improve here is the fact that if you, that is Doug, as the sole reviewer in most of the cases, practically, and you are the only person with the landing rights, we don't necessarily need to put the red X, because I mean, the red X coming on the front of the PR is kind of a psychological issue that is being generated on the contributor side, and then it suddenly gets into a kind of a tension between the contributor and the reviewer. I mean, it's just my personal opinion. And then we can institute something called as a hierarchical review, whereas we could start by looking at the intent, whether the intent and the objective of this PR is in the right way, and the architecture, if that makes sense, or the design, the high level design of this PR, we can set it straight, and then come to the code, actual lines of code, and then probably the nitpicks and things, the styles and things like that. So that way, the contributor or the author gets the right message at the early stage about the architectural direction or the high level view, what is the kind of changes we are looking at and things like that.
Yep, makes sense.
I've never heard that term hierarchical review before. Is that like an actual practice that people use somewhere that I can learn about?
I don't know. I've seen all types of views based on the reviewers' skills and time availability and things like that. People come with, probably somebody start with a nitpick, and then somebody comes and questions the or reviews the design aspect. But from the contributor's perspective, what happens is, once, suppose I'm the author, look at from my angle, right? I addressed all the styles and nitpicks. Then I make some changes to the code, and finally, after maybe couple of months, somebody is coming and questioning the very relevance of the high-level design, the API interface itself, and then that affects my morale, right? Whereas if I set those high-level things straight, make the changes as required at top level, and then come to the bottom, and finally end with the style changes, that's an order. And not necessarily it changes anything with respect to the PR, but it really helps the author a lot.
I like that idea. So it sounds to me like you're advocating for a better workflow for reviewing PRs, basically. That, well, specifically that, like, one, looks after the contributor, et cetera. But I also like that idea. As somebody that contributes, it sounds like it would waste less time to get, like, if somebody went through what's the intent? Do I agree or disagree with your intent? If it passes that, or we don't have any changes to that, go to the actual design and the approach, the way you're going to plan to implement the changes. Are there any nits with that? And then to the actual lines of code, potential, like, then I would then see like suggestions on lines of code, like, hey, change this to this, or style stuff, etc. I like that idea. As a contributor, I think that sounds good.
Yeah, it probably doesn't work well with the agile methodology or things like that. Probably for Node.js, for example, where we have 100 plus collaborators who are actively reviewing the PRs, it may be hard to harness or put some process around how you should be doing reviews and things like it. It might make it a little bit difficult for them. But for Express, where we have very little reviewers, probably it makes sense. That's my personal opinion. I mean, my whole process proposal is looking from the end users or the contributors perspective, how to make the contribution a better experience. How do we leave a better impression when people come with the code changes or issues to the repo?
So yeah, that's a fair enough comment. Yeah, I mean, we see what you're saying, that things have taken too long in the past, but mostly that's because there's been really no support for Darkia, and I think now that we've got more people here to actually do things, that is possible. And I think that is something perhaps we should look at. I think if a process at Doug as well, guys, look at this. It's not, I cannot do it all on my own. You go and look, and if you find something wrong, I'm not even going to bother. If all of you are okay, then I shall bother. Because we when we have subject matter experts, but if even the non-subject matter experts have severe misgivings, then it shouldn't even get to the subject matter expert. There'd be some regular gatekeepers, and that's probably a really good suggestion.
Yeah, sounds like it's like there's two things, at least that come to my mind, and it's structure and then there's speed. So it's like, when a PR is being reviewed, it sounds like it would be nice for collaborators to know that there's a bit more structure that the reviewer will be following, and that, like you mentioned, this like hierarchical type of system where you go like the broader, higher level things, and then eventually, if those things all check out, then you can get into the weeds of the actual code. But even if that, let's say that did happen once, if things went silent after that for several months, it would still be a little disheartening for someone trying to contribute. So Glenn, to your point, I think like if we can somehow, this is probably ties back to getting more people involved in repos and giving Doug more support where we can, we'll hopefully resolve that.
Yeah, and I think a big thing too is like, as we continue to do this and we start chewing down things like these backlogs of issues and PRs can also really help with the timeline too, because for a good example is like, it's kind of like the situation that we're in right now a little bit, which kind of like hurts on time, is like, you have like, say you have a repo that has like, 20 PRs in it, right? Then of course, well, another PR comes in, so you start reviewing that, and then like say someone else starts pinging on another PR, and it's like, well, we need help here, right? So you'd say, okay, well, I have, I'm just giving you an example, right? So then you're like, all right, well, I had a little bit of time tonight, so I'll go help with that PR because they're the one making the noise, right? And then of course, inevitably, sometimes if the person who's not making noise, their thing accidentally gets lost, and it kind of like, it kind of like exaggerates the issue with having so many open PRs, which is certainly why, like, for example, like that was one of the things that, like, I think like we're actually starting to get a little bit of a headway with, because even just like last night, it really got to me, about having some of these things. So I stayed up like way too late, like till 5 a.m. my time. I'm so tired right now, in fact, because of that. But like, I'm just like, I'm going to try to get almost as many possible PRs in this Express.js.com freaking merged in here. So there's just not like a ton of these just hanging around, and I think that was just, obviously, that was a pretty easy repo. Some of these repos are certainly much harder than that one, but like, I think like part of that, and I think it can contribute to the way the contributor feels if they make a PR, right? And then no one's replying to their PR for a little bit. And then of course, I'm sure they go look over and like, look at all these PRs sitting open from like, 2 years ago. I'll probably never get my PR done. Like, not to say that they won't, but it certainly does not help with that feeling at all. So I think like, even just, so like, as we work through some of these like backlog of stuff, I think will help in a lot of, at least the time aspect, right? So like we said, there's two, the structure and the time part. So at least the time one, I think that we're on track to. And I think the structure one, I think, is a good one, right? Because I definitely get where he's coming from, because I can emphasize with that for sure, right? If I were to make a PR and then like say someone comes in and like goes, oh, you should put like this over here or this over here, and I'm like sitting there like, I'm like, oh sweet, I feel engaged, so I'm like making the PR requests, and then for that, suddenly that person goes silent, probably because I satisfied them. And then of course, like, maybe a week later someone goes by and says, no, we don't, this API doesn't belong in here. Go away. It's like, cool. So I think that is part of like I feel like that encompasses the idea of the hierarchical concept of the review, is to kind of like almost like try to say, is it possible for us to do that high level review as early as possible before the nitpick review? Of course, ignoring any nitpicks that, tools will already give, like lint tools or whatever, but still, I think that makes a lot of sense as well. And I know I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to try to do, and I think that, yeah, it can, I've tried, like in the past, like I've tried to do stuff where it's like, especially when it's a cold PR is what I'll call them. Usually like it's a PR out of nowhere that seem, especially when it's a new API, like it's more of a feature request than like, here's a bug, I fixed the bug. Or here's this open issue that has had this discussion and now here's the PR for it. A cold PR is usually, I would call it like just a PR suddenly out of nowhere with no previous conversation. It's a new feature. Those, I think, like, thinking about the hierarchical review to me, like, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, like, to me, that almost like says like the first conversation in there should almost be like, hey, let's understand this new feature request and how it fits in, versus starting to nitpick on it only then decide. it doesn't fit in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. On that note, do you have any actions or notes taken on the lines of adding new committers?
Yeah. Like we said last time, like it's all spelled out already in our, what's it called? It's escaping
contributions.
Isn't it? The Express.js community contributing guide 1.0. I mean, if we want to change how it's done, we certainly can. But otherwise, we are currently following what is set out.
My question is more on the lines. I mean, we all agree that Express three organizations, will largely benefit from having more committers.
Yep.
So, what is the next step on that? Who is taking action? Is it self-nomination versus the TC nominating, or what is the driving on that front? Was my question.
Yeah, it's so it's like, I mean, it's typically just as it's spelled out there, right? Like landing non-trivial contributions to repos is the method to be onboarded as a committer on the repo. So pretty straightforward, it seems, at least.
Okay, so what you're saying is people who have been contributing, reflect on that and make an assertion about, okay, I have made non-trivial contributions and I claim for committership, or I request through an issue, rather than the TC proactively figuring out the list of potential committers and propose. I mean, I'm just asking.
Right.
What
yeah,
is it?
no, it's both, really. Is that the TC should be, obviously watching the repos, and as they see, especially new people on board, they'll certainly ask if they want to be a committer or not. Certainly, people who feel like they already meet them can obviously also bring it up as well. So it's really both sides, I would say. I mean, it's not spelled out who is the initiator. It just spells out the process, like what it kind of is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. At this point, for me, practically TC means you. So that's why, I mean, it's pretty much.
I mean, Linus is here from the TC.
Yeah, Fez used to come, Linus used to come. Yeah, but yeah, I got the point. So thanks.
Yeah. No, yeah. And I know I'm happy on board. I know I've already noticed at least there's at least like a few people like who look like they're very likely to, meet such a requirement for like the session repo, for example. And as we also discussed too, is that we don't currently have a mechanism that restricts you per repo. So really, I guess it would generally just end up being for the Express.js org. We don't really like fine grain it today. But of course, we also mentioned like with the concept of the code owners, is that maybe we might do that, just because if there's a whole bunch of people all over the place, like it might make sense. I know there was a security discussion that also might make it sense there, kind of like, because I know people apparently like poking at the least, principle of least privilege crap side of our permissions model or whatever. So I don't know where that's going to go, but still. But yeah, so that's kind of like, and that's kind of the main thing. The other thing is like, GitHub, just to clarify too, I think it was mentioned a couple times before, is that GitHub allows anybody to review any pull request, right? Like not just through the official review mechanism, but review via comments. And I do want to mention, like, reflect back on, I think I mentioned it before, like, back when I first came to Express and first got started, like that was actually pretty much like the main method I got started with, really getting deep on it, was being a reviewer. I never had commit rights. I never was actually a part of it. I just started reviewing things because I used it. I like understood the whole thing in and out because I used it really well. as examples to me too, when I think about contributors or committers and stuff, is like when we had the mention, just to set expectations, right? At least in my mind, is like, when we talked about the Express.js.com site, and there was like how there was missing documented APIs, typically of some, people who, an example would be like, I would expect a person who is a committer on a repo, that just those notes are enough to know exactly what it is and how to and what the documentation would be and how to do it, right? Because you'd kind of like have an understanding of how it's all working, right? If you don't really have an understanding of how it all even works, like it seems like it would be hard to really successfully land things without causing regressions. I've seen it happen over and over again in projects. That's why Michael actually shut down the request project through all its controversy, because it was just easier than to pass it off and then just have a world of regressions flow through the entire ecosystem. So I think that was his call on that one. Whether he made the right call, I don't know, but that was what he decided to do. Mocha has kind of like gone through that flow. It feels like handlebars, which is the thing I was just talking to today, is going through that same pain right now. It is kind of like candidate to some complete, like, they just kind of like just completely handed over to some new committers. And this is not to say they're not trying their best. They absolutely are. But of course, it's just like there's a lot of knowledge tied up all over the place, and that's hard to get going. And of course, it ripples all across the ecosystem when there's weird things published and things. So I don't know. It's hard. I'm not saying it's not hard. It's hard for everybody, I think. And part of it is try to make it. There's no way to be perfect because we're all human. So there's no expectation of stuff being perfect. But the idea from that, which like the then Node.js, now OpenJS Foundation put into place with our guidelines, was, I think, part of that thought process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep, but I mean, part of it is about the qualifying criteria to be a committer based on the contribution to the overall organization. Part of it is to also address some of the challenges and outstanding problems which we have. And if having more committers is the right thing to do, of course, we keep minimum qualifications around that process, etc. But look at the wider problem and see if that particular aspect is going to help with that problem. So, yeah.
Yep, and I think like the other difference, I think that's a little bit here between some of those other projects I mentioned, is like, I think we have some core people like myself who haven't like just disappeared, if that makes sense, right? I think we're kind of like just bottlenecked versus like abandoned the project, right? So like I think a lot of those things where it's like becomes abandoned, you almost have like, you only have the extremes possible, right? Randomly hand it over, to some other people who will maybe or maybe not do it justice. The debug project is yet another example of that. Like, it's funny, I just brought up another issue in there. It seems like he had changed his mind after initially not on a different topic, but that's kind of cool. We heavily use the debug dependency. That's why I track that one. But yeah, and to be clear too, like when it says becoming a committer, the non-trivial contributions don't have to be pull requests themselves either, right? Like having valuable, when we talked about review hierarchy, right? Like that is a big thing. Like even just to be able to like have someone who's able to do like reviews and actually like, contribute in that way is a really large contribution. I'm sure Glenn, just looking through the session, can attest to something like that, right? Like,
trust me,
be able to truly review a change to that.
I thought session was trivial. I think, I'll go for the trivial one. No, it is not trivial. And that code is the old type of JavaScript, which I think I forgot about.
So yeah, like doing like doing reviews and stuff like that, it is a contribution. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Like, as the thing, it says contribution on purpose, I think, because there's lots of different ways to contribute, right? Through documentation. Think about Rand. Rand not only became a committer, but like part of the TC himself, and he has not contributed really a piece of code anywhere. He's been mainly a technical doc writer, right? And like he's contributed in a really big ways in that regard. So I just want to just keep iterating that as much as I can, is that there are many ways to contribute, and it does not necessarily mean committing code, though that doesn't mean that doesn't mean it's off the table. It's just like that's not the only way. I just want to always make that clear, in that the contributions all over the place, from triaging issues coming in to reviewing pull requests, to all writing docs and stuff, are all immensely valuable to the project and really all the users of the project. I'm sure Glenn can see, like, especially with Express Session, like, it's one example, one of those modules where I spent probably like some crazy disproportionate amount of time just trying to write tests to it, because writing tests to me is a form of force multiplication, because it allows people to more easily contribute code by having that safety net of a test suite that should hopefully tell them when they're breaking something. And that just accelerates everybody thing, right? Even the reviewer, they don't have to like sit here and like delicately try it out. They can rely on the test suite to just answer the question, does it break something or not? So
this is almost a little tangential, but I've been thinking a lot personally about workflow. I've been trying to figure out my workflow for contributing in terms of triage and all that stuff, and trying to document what I'm doing. And I've learned a lot just by watching Doug, essentially, in terms of I get all the notifications in the repo, so I'm up to date often on what he does, et cetera. But one of the things that I've noticed is that like I'm now suddenly much more aware of things to do in the project. And so that's why I need some workflow, is that I haven't been managing my time well in terms of what I want to do. So there's things that I'll see Doug, like I saw him go on that tear the other night where he closed a bunch of Express.js.com issues. And I thought about it and I was like, that's stuff that I feel like I should do or can be doing. And so it's like, for me, I'm trying to figure out a workflow of like, okay, what can I do to best utilize my time? And I feel like that's probably a barrier to people that want to come and be serious contributors to the project in general, is just unless you carve off a very small part of the project like session, or not a small part, but a focused part, it can be difficult to
that is fair enough. Carving off a small part is actually a good way of doing it, even if when you carve off a small part, it wasn't quite as small as you thought it was. But right. that is my tactic. I just as a trio, I don't think I can cope with doing everything. If I can get one thing golden and understood, then I can move on. And so, everyone try and be humble. It is a big project. And I think I've learned more about cookies and parsing, even though I've been using that module for years, than I actually knew about before. Now I have respect for the thing that did the work for me.
Yeah. And so I think I've been thinking a lot about process, which is something I hate, and not hate, but I've spent so much time in other projects talking about process with people. And I'm very sensitive to when it's a burden or when it's good or whatever. But I think that could be a big step forward for the project in general. Once we get 5 out, is just figuring out like, what and how to contribute. And that's one of the reasons I really like the idea that Ganesh had about the reviews. Is I know that specifically a lot of that is about the timeline, the time frame in the review and how long sometimes things sit. But I also really like the idea of having a workflow of like, okay, if I have time, here's what I can do to this PR to review it and make a meaningful impact. Here's basically like what's wanted, what is needed, and then trying to be able to turn people loose and be like, if you have an hour this week, do these things, please. So that way, until we're able to figure out how to remove the bottleneck on having fewer committers or whatever. Basically, I see it as like one of the ways I can move the project forward is if Doug has more time to do the things that only he can do right now, then it helps move things forward that I can't. It helps unblock me on other things too, basically. So I won't go too deep into it because it's a tangent, but I've been thinking a lot about workflow and stuff. Just like I said, personally, not trying to push anything on the project right now, but I think eventually figuring out a good workflow and then trying to give some of it back to the project would help a lot. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
One other thing I think for the next meeting we should take, we don't need to document this. We do need someone to be a good timekeeper on this call, because we're not keeping the schedule, and that's where the product or the project person would come in handy and say, yeah, we continue, because we just need to be disciplined. This is another discipline aspect.
Yep. In fact, with that note, we really do need to wrap up anyways. So I think that there's a lot of good discussion. I'm going to try to also follow up here. I know usually Suresh will also do that in our issue on some of these items. I think there's a lot of good thoughts in here too. I actually have a whole bunch of ideas from just like what John was saying for his workflow on stuff that can help a lot, especially not losing track of things. And maybe we could potentially improve that because that's I think a really good thing. But of course, those can always be offline / other TC meetings as well. So that way we can get this wrapped up. So any final things anybody needs to get off their chest before we wrap this up? Alrighty. Well, thank you guys for joining with this TC meeting. Sorry it ended up going about approximately 20-ish or so minutes over time. But hopefully there was a lot of good information here for you. We'll have another one next week as well.